Welcome to today's episode, hosted by Melinda Lane, with special guest Oren Cohen.
Welcome to Behind the Badge, where we give candidates an inside look at the people shaping Fortrea's mission. Today, I'm joined by Chief Medical Officer Dr. Oren Cohen. Dr. Cohen, what advice would you give to someone who wants to make a meaningful impact in clinical research?
When you think about all the elements that have to come together in a clinical trial, it is really extraordinary. I mean, sometimes I take a half step back and it's a wonder that any individual clinical trial ever gets done. And then to think that there's a whole program of trials that are building blocks toward the eventual approval of a drug. It is a massive, massive undertaking, massive amounts of data. That is why the process takes years to complete. It's extraordinarily complex. What I like to advise people is to adopt sort of a Japanese mindset. There's a saying in Japanese that says, "Ganbatte kudasai." It means, I will genuinely try my best. And it fits perfectly with how we do things in clinical pharmacology. Our clinical trials are so full of granular detail that matters. It's incredibly important. What may seem like an incredibly minute detail may be fantastically critical to getting the pharmacokinetic data of how a drug behaves in the human body. It is really up to all of us as stakeholders in this massive process to do our very best to be as precise as humanly possible to get the best quality data. And there's no task that's too small. There are no insignificant tasks, whether it's the temperature of the ice bath that test tubes are put in, or the exact speed of the centrifuge that is spinning the tubes, or the precision with which the plasma is collected. There is no detail that is insignificant. I think the meaningful contribution comes from best efforts to really understand the process and to do it to the best of our capabilities. That's what makes a great clinical trial. And it literally takes a village. It takes an entire team, and it takes that focus and concentration and genuine caring about the outcome.
Great. Thank you. What drives your passion for clinical pharmacology, and how has that shaped your leadership here at Fortrea?
In my youth, I was fascinated by the story of the discovery of DNA, and that really shaped my early interest in science. And growing up in the Washington, D.C. area, I had the unbelievable good fortune to be able to be a pre-graduate intern at the National Institutes of Health, originally in the National Cancer Institute, and then eventually did my fellowship at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. This was as HIV was coming onto the scene. And I started working in the laboratory on HIV before we knew what it was. And so there were gay men who were becoming ill with really very unusual opportunistic infections and malignancies. And we were studying cells in the laboratory, trying to understand what was going on. And this eventually culminated in the discovery of HIV itself. I was going through my medical training in those very first years of the HIV pandemic. And so I did get to see some of that bench to bedside translation of some of those very earliest drug development activities. So when I was a medical student locally at Duke University, I was working in the laboratory as the very first clinical trial of AZT was being done. And we were quantitating the amount of viral reverse transcriptase in people's blood before and after treatment with AZT. And I did get to go into the hospital to see some of those patients. And originally that clinical trial of AZT, this was just AZT single therapy at the time. That was all that was available. It was called the Lazarus drug. I mean, people got up off their deathbed and felt amazingly well. Unfortunately, for a very brief period of time, because resistance to a single nucleoside analog in that case, emerges very quickly. So it really only lasted weeks or a month or two at most. But the effect was so dramatic, and that made a lifelong impression about, wow, here is science being married up with drug development, bench to bedside, and you see this dramatic result. Sometimes it's very useful to take a step back and think about the arc of history. 100 years ago, anybody with any sort of joint disease, there were textbooks of rheumatism. Well, that was it. There was whatever you had in whatever joint, whatever type of pain, you had rheumatism. I mean, now we know that there's osteoarthritis, there's rheumatoid arthritis, there's psoriatic arthritis, there's lupus. There's whole textbooks of all the different flavors. And now we're understanding it's still primitive. In 50 years, this will look like, oh my God, this was the Stone Age where we were giving, certain biologics to broad classes of these different kinds of arthritis conditions. The fact is, we've come a huge long way over the last 100 years, and this will continue. It's iterative. As we understand more about disease processes, we get better at developing therapies that are targeted for these diseases. So that passion was instilled in me very, very early on, witnessing that sort of bench to bedside translation of something that was quite miraculous. But in fact, it's not so exceptional. You can look at almost any condition. You can look at the prognosis for patients with certain kinds of cancer over the last number of decades, for cardiovascular disease, now for obesity. Drug development truly does make an enormous world of difference for patients in need with all kinds of diseases. And that is just so exciting to me.
How does CPS in your particular area at Fortrea contribute to solving global health challenges?
It is such a privilege to have the front row seat that we have in that first entree into clinical drug development. So we do dozens of first-in-human trials every year in our clinics, and that is quite amazing. Again, you have to take a half step back, because when you look at what it looks like in the clinic can look very routine. There's a lot of repetitive procedures. It doesn't necessarily look like an elegant movie, but you take a half step back and understand what's happening, that we're taking an experimental drug, that's the product of a huge amount of research about a disease and a potential target for a medication, the design of that medication, the synthesis of it, the delivery of it into the clinical setting, the recruitment of the volunteers, bringing them into the clinic, all those things that I was talking about, that it takes a village. Seeing that come to life is the initial, it sets the course for that program. Yes, sure, many drugs fail and don't ultimately make it to market, but that's also extremely important to know. So the work that we do, whether a drug is ultimately successful or not, the work that we do is incredibly important, no matter what the outcome, but certainly extra exciting when it is successful. And we've seen so many examples over the years where drugs that we have put first time into humans eventually get approved and then are taken by however many people. Sometimes it's not a large number if it's a rare disease, but sometimes it's, in the case of obesity drugs, seems like maybe half the planet is benefiting from these medications. It's quite exciting.
Because CPS is the first stop, I guess, for the clinics and in drug development, what does collaboration look like? Because we are that first area with the later phases and with the other functions within the organization.
I'm going to go back to the it takes a village concept. Certainly within clinical pharmacology, there are so many tasks. There are so many parts of the clinical trial. And it really does take what we refer to in our clinical pharmacology business as our integrated platform. We think about the clinical research unit as a very critical place where this kind of research takes place, and it is critically important, but there are so many other functions that come to play. The project management, the biometrics organization, whether it's the medical writing, statistics, data management, all those different functions within the clinic itself, our physicians, our nurses, our technicians, our pharmacists. It takes a very, very large village to bring these things to life. And it does take collaboration and coordination to tame the beast. I mean, it is managing complexity at a very large scale. It's no easy feat. It takes a huge amount of effort. And that's what we do every day.
Thank you. Well, you heard it from Dr. Cohen himself. Come join our village.
Open yourself to new opportunities at careers.fortria.com. Scan the QR code and join Fortria's talent network today.